There are towns in America where the government knew the water was poisoned and said nothing. Towns where they knew the soil was toxic and told residents it was safe. Towns where children were growing up on land that was slowly destroying their nervous systems, and the agency responsible for protecting them was aware, had the data, and made a calculation that saying nothing was easier than saying something. These are not conspiracy theories. These are court findings, congressional investigations, EPA designations, settled lawsuits, documents released under the Freedom of Information Act that show, in the government's own words, what they knew and when they knew it, and what they chose to do about it. These are 10 American towns that were poisoned by the government, then abandoned. And number 1 is a town where the contamination was so severe, so deliberately concealed, and affected so many people over so many decades that the full accounting of what happened there is still not complete. Number 10, Times Beach, Missouri. In 1972, the city of Times Beach had a dust problem. The roads were unpaved and the dust was constant, coating houses and cars and children playing outside. The city hired a waste hauler named Russell Bliss to spray the roads with oil to keep the dust down. Standard practice, cheap, effective. What Russell Bliss sprayed was not just oil. Bliss had been contracted to dispose of waste from a chemical plant that produced hexachlorophene, a disinfectant. The waste contained dioxin, specifically TCD, one of the most toxic synthetic compounds ever produced. Bliss mixed the dioxin waste with the oil and sprayed it on the roads of Times Beach and dozens of other locations across Missouri. He did not tell anyone what was in it. The EPA began investigating in 1982, after animals and children in areas Bliss had sprayed started showing signs of serious illness. They tested Times Beach in December 1982. The results came back at levels 100 times above what the CDC considered safe for human exposure. On December 23, 1982, the Merrimack River flooded Times Beach. The dioxin-soaked soil washed through every home in the community. On January 26, 1983, the EPA announced that Times Beach was permanently uninhabitable. The federal government bought out every property. All 2,000 residents were relocated. The town was demolished building by building. The cleanup took until 1997. The contaminated soil was incinerated on site in a facility that burned for years. The land was eventually converted into a state park, a park where a town used to be, on soil that had to be incinerated before children could safely walk on it. The government did not poison Times Beach deliberately, but the regulatory failure that allowed Russell Bliss to operate without oversight to dispose of dioxin waste by spraying it on residential roads was a failure of the systems that were supposed to prevent exactly this. 2,000 people, one contractor with a tank truck, and a city that ceased to exist. Number 9, Treese, Kansas. Treese sits directly on the Kansas side of the same mining district that produced Pitcher, Oklahoma. The same lead and zinc mines, the same toxic waste piles, the same generations of families living in the shadow of chat heaps loaded with heavy metals. Everything that happened in Pitcher happened in Treese. The blood tests, the lead levels in children, the acid mine drainage turned the creek orange. The sinkholes opened in yards as abandoned shafts collapsed beneath the streets. The difference is that Treese had fewer people and less political visibility. Where Pitcher's story became national news, congressional hearings, EPA designations, documentary films, Treese went through the same process more quietly, with less attention and less funding. By 2010, the EPA had confirmed that the contamination in Treese was severe enough to warrant full relocation. The Kansas government offered buyouts. Most families took them. The last residents left in 2012. Treese was officially dissolved as a city in 2012. The post office closed. The zip code was retired. The buildings were demolished. The infrastructure was removed. What remained were the chat piles. Still there, still leaching. The cleanup, like Pitcher's, is measured in decades, not years. A town that went through the same poisoning as its more famous neighbor in the same region from the same mines and was erased so quietly that most people who know about Pitcher have never heard of Treese. Same poison, different silence. Number 8. Libby, Montana. For 70 years, the W.R. Grace Mining Company extracted vermiculite from a mine above the town of Libby, Montana. Vermiculite is used in insulation, gardening, and construction. The vermiculite from Libby was some of the highest quality in the world. W.R. Grace shipped it across the country. It ended up in attic insulation in homes across America, in potting soil sold at garden centers, in building materials used in schools and offices. The vermiculite from Libby was also contaminated with tremolite asbestos. Every ton of vermiculite that came out of that mine carried asbestos with it, and W.R. Grace knew. Internal company documents obtained during litigation showed that W.R. Grace was aware of the asbestos contamination as early as the 1960s. They conducted health studies on their own workers. They found elevated rates of asbestosis and lung disease. They did not share those findings with workers or the public. They did not stop mining. The mine ran from 1919 to 1990. During that time, the asbestos dust settled over the town. It contaminated the export plant where vermiculite was processed before shipping. It contaminated the ballpark where Little League games were played on a field spread with vermiculite tailings. It contaminated the ice skating rink with the same material. By 1999, when the Seattle Post-Intelligencer published an investigation into the Libby mine, the death toll among former workers and residents had already reached into the hundreds. The EPA declared Libby a public health emergency in 2009, the first time in agency history that designation had ever been used. Over 400 people in Libby have died from asbestos-related disease. Over 3,000 have been diagnosed with asbestos-related illness. W.R. Grace filed for bankruptcy in 2001. The EPA cleanup of Libby has cost over $600 million and is not finished. The town still exists. People still live there. But the community that exists now lives with the knowledge that 3 generations of their neighbors were slowly killed by a company that knew what it was doing and continued doing it. Libby was not abandoned, but the people who should have protected it, the regulators who received the data and did not act, the company that suppressed its own health studies, abandoned the town long before anyone died. Number 7. Picher, Oklahoma. Picher has been mentioned in this channel before, but the full story of what the government knew and when deserves its own account. The lead and zinc mines of the Tri-State Mining District produced ore for decades before Picher became the center of the operation. At peak production during World War I, the mines supplied over half of all the lead used to manufacture American ammunition. The federal government did not just permit this operation. It actively encouraged it. War production required it. The chat piles, the mountains of toxic mining waste, accumulated over decades with no federal regulation of their content or placement. They were built in and around residential areas because that was where the workers lived and the land was cheapest. Nobody in a federal office required otherwise. By the 1970s, when the EPA was created and began assessing contaminated sites, Picher was on the list. By 1983, it was a designated Superfund site. The blood tests that found lead poisoning in 63% of children came in 1996. The gap between those dates, 1983 to 1996, is 13 years. 13 years between federal acknowledgement that the site was contaminated and the blood tests that revealed what that contamination was doing to children who were growing up there. In those 13 years, children were attending school in Picher, playing outside in Picher, breathing the dust from the chat piles in Picher, while federal agencies with knowledge of the contamination determined the appropriate response. The buyout came in the early 2000s. The last residents left after the 2008 tornado. The town was dissolved in 2009. What the government produced during those 13 years was paperwork. What the children produced was brain damage that doesn't reverse. Number 6. Institute, West Virginia. Institute is a small community on the Kanawha River in West Virginia, home to West Virginia State University and, for most of the 20th century, a Union Carbide chemical plant. On August 11, 1985, Less than a year after the Union Carbide disaster in Bhopal, India killed thousands, a leak at the Institute plant released aldecarb oxime and methylene chloride into the air over the community. Over 135 people were hospitalized. Hundreds more reported symptoms. What followed was not an evacuation. It was not a full public health investigation. It was a period of conflicting statements from Union Carbide about what had been released, in what quantities, and what health effects could be expected. The EPA's monitoring in the months following the leak found that the Institute plant had been releasing toxic chemicals into the surrounding community at levels that exceeded safety thresholds, not from the August incident alone, but routinely, as part of normal plant operations. The community around the Institute was predominantly black. West Virginia State University and HBCU sat adjacent to the plant. The pattern of a chemical facility operating in a minority community with lax regulatory oversight, releasing toxics into the surrounding residential area, and facing minimal accountability was not unique to the Institute. But the proximity to a university, to a community with historical significance, made the regulatory failure particularly stark. The plant continued operating after the 1985 leak. Regulatory changes were promised. Some were implemented. The community that lived in the shadow of the plant continued living there, breathing the air without ever receiving a full accounting of what they had been exposed to or for how long. The Institute was not abandoned. Its people had nowhere to go and no buyout offered. They stayed on land they had built next to a plant that had poisoned their air, waiting for oversight that arrived late and left incomplete. Number 5. Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. From 1953 to 1987, the drinking water at Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune was contaminated with trichloroethylene, tetrachloroethylene, benzene, and vinyl chloride, industrial solvents linked to cancer, birth defects, and neurological damage. Nearly 1 million military personnel, their families, and civilian workers were exposed. Children were born on the base during those decades. Families drank the water, bathed in it, cooked with it, for years without being told anything was wrong. The Navy first identified contamination in the water supply in 1982. They began closing contaminated wells, without telling the families living on the base why the wells were being closed. It took until 2012, 30 years after the contamination was first identified internally, for Congress to pass the Honoring America's Veterans and Caring for Camp Lejeune Families Act, which extended health care to affected veterans. Even then, it covered veterans but not all family members and civilians who had been exposed. The list of conditions linked to Camp Lejeune exposure includes leukemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, bladder cancer, kidney cancer, liver cancer, multiple myeloma, Parkinson's disease, and several specific birth defects. Marines who spent their careers serving the country came home to cancer. Their children were born with conditions they spent decades trying to understand. And for 30 years, the institution that exposed them said nothing about what it had known since 1982. In 2022, the Camp Lejeune Justice Act was signed into law, allowing affected individuals to sue the federal government for the first time. Hundreds of thousands of claims were filed. The base is still operational. The Marines are still there. But the water that ran through those pipes for 34 years and the decision to close the wells quietly without telling anyone why represents one of the most sustained failures of duty of care in the history of the American military. Number 4. Jacksonville, Arkansas. In 1984, the EPA ranked Vertac Chemical Company's facility in Jacksonville, Arkansas as the most contaminated Superfund site in the United States. The Vertac plant had produced herbicides, including Agent Orange components, since the 1940s. Decades of production had left the soil, groundwater, and Bayou Mato Creek downstream saturated with dioxin, the same compound that contaminated Times Beach. The community around the plant had been living with the contamination for decades before the EPA designation. Children in neighborhoods adjacent to the plant showed elevated rates of cancer and birth defects that local doctors had been documenting since the 1970s. Those doctors had filed reports. The reports had gone to state and federal agencies. The EPA cleanup of the Vertac site took until 2001. 17 years after the site was identified as the most contaminated in the country. During those 17 years, the community continued living adjacent to the site. The cleanup involved incinerating the dioxin-contaminated soil on site, which generated its own community health concerns during the incineration process. The company responsible for the contamination went bankrupt. The federal government paid for most of the cleanup. The people who lived next to the plant while it operated, and while it sat contaminated and while it was cleaned up, received no relocation assistance. They stayed because they had nowhere else to go and no one was offering them a choice. Jacksonville still exists. The site has been remediated, but the generation of children who grew up adjacent to the most contaminated Superfund site in America in 1984 are now adults carrying whatever that exposure produced in their bodies. Number 3, Tar Creek, Oklahoma. Tar Creek is the water that runs through the same tri-state mining district that produced Picher and Treese. And it is exactly what its name suggests when mining waste gets into the groundwater. The creek turned red-orange in the 1970s when abandoned mine shafts flooded and began pumping acid mine drainage to the surface. The water that came up was loaded with heavy metals, iron, lead, zinc, cadmium, at concentrations that made it visually, obviously, immediately wrong. You could see it. The color was unmistakable. The EPA designated Tar Creek a Superfund site in 1983. It was one of the original Superfund designations among the first group of sites identified under the newly passed Comprehensive Environmental Response Act. 40 years later, Tar Creek is still contaminated, still running orange, still on the Superfund list. The cleanup has consumed hundreds of millions of dollars and has not produced a clean creek. What makes Tar Creek different from Picher, which at least received a buyout and was demolished, is that communities along the creek were not fully relocated. Families stayed. Children grew up near the orange water. The contamination that was identified and designated and funded for cleanup in 1983 is still there, still visible, still producing the same health outcomes that prompted the designation 4 decades ago. The most underfunded, most overlooked, most visually obvious environmental disaster in the American Midwest. A creek running the color of rust through communities that were never fully helped, never fully relocated, never fully remediated. Still orange, still there, still waiting. Number 2, Hinckley, California. Most people know Hinckley because of Erin Brockovich, the film, the lawsuit, the settlement. What most people don't know is what happened after the cameras left. Pacific Gas and Electric used hexavalent chromium-6, to prevent rust in compressor station equipment at its Hinckley facility from 1952 to 1966. The chromium waste was deposited in unlined ponds and leaked into the groundwater beneath the surrounding community. By the 1980s, residents were experiencing cancers, miscarriages, and chronic illnesses at rates that couldn't be explained by chance. Erin Brockovich, working as a legal clerk, built the case that linked the illnesses to the chromium contamination. In 1996, PG&E settled for $333 million. The largest settlement ever paid in a direct action lawsuit in U.S. history at the time. The cameras left. The story was declared over. It was not over. Studies conducted after the settlement found that chromium-6 levels in Hinckley's groundwater were still rising in some areas. The contamination plume, the underground spread of the toxic water, had not stopped. It was moving. By 2013, the plume had expanded so significantly that the settlement-funded cleanup was not keeping pace with it. Families who had stayed in Hinckley after the settlement, believing the money meant the problem was solved, were still living above contaminated groundwater. By 2015, the population of Hinckley had dropped from 2,000 to fewer than 400. As families who could leave did, Hinckley was not officially abandoned, but the community that existed when Erin Brockovich arrived has largely dispersed, scattered by a contamination that a $333 million settlement did not fix, and that continued spreading after the case that made it famous was declared closed. The movie had an ending. The water did not. Number 1, Anniston, Alabama. Anniston is the one that should be more famous than it is, the one where the full accounting of what happened, what was known, what was concealed, for how long, by whom, is more damning than almost any other environmental contamination case in American history. Monsanto operated a chemical plant in Anniston from 1929 to 1971, producing PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, used in electrical equipment. During those 40 years, they dumped PCB waste into an open-pit landfill adjacent to the plant, discharged PCB-laden water directly into Snow Creek, which ran through the predominantly black neighborhoods west of the plant, and buried PCB waste in fields around the facility. And they monitored the effects internally for decades. Company documents obtained during litigation showed that Monsanto conducted studies on fish in Snow Creek as early as 1966. The fish were so contaminated that they died within seconds of being placed in the creek water. Monsanto's internal report noted the finding and recommended continued monitoring. They did not stop the discharges. They did not inform the community. In 1969, a Monsanto manager wrote an internal memo acknowledging that the entire Anniston community was being exposed to PCB contamination, and that the company needed to decide whether to continue operations knowing this. The conclusion was to continue operations. They continued for 2 more years until PCBs were publicly linked to cancer and Monsanto ceased production. The contamination they left behind was catastrophic. PCBs do not break down. They accumulate in fatty tissue and move up the food chain. Residents of West Anniston who ate fish from Snow Creek, who grew vegetables in soil adjacent to the landfill, who let their children play near the creek, they accumulated PCBs in their bodies at levels that, when finally tested in 2002, were among the highest ever recorded in any human population. In 2003, Monsanto, by then operating as Solucia, settled a class-action lawsuit for $700 million. It was at the time the largest environmental contamination settlement in U.S. history. The settlement did not clean the soil, it did not clean the creek, it did not remove the landfill. It compensated the people who could be identified and documented as harmed. The community of West Anniston still exists. The contamination in the soil still exists. The creek runs through a neighborhood that was poisoned for 40 years by a company that monitored the poisoning in real time and made a business decision to continue. No one from Monsanto was criminally charged. The settlement was paid. The story moved on. And in West Anniston, on streets adjacent to a creek that ran with PCB waste for 4 decades, families are still living on land that a company's own internal documents described as contaminated while they were contaminating it. That is not negligence. That is a decision made in a boardroom, documented in memos, and paid for in the end by everyone except the people who made it. 10 towns, 10 different versions of the same story. A company that knew, an agency that looked away, a community that was told the water was fine, the air was safe, the soil was clean, while the documents that said otherwise were sitting in filing cabinets in offices they would never see. The difference between these towns and the ones that made national news is usually not the severity of the contamination. It is the wealth of the community, the political connections of the residents, the color of their skin, the question of who, in the end, someone in a government office decided was worth protecting. Drop a comment below. Have you heard of all of these? And tell me, which one do you think deserves its own full video? Subscribe. New story every single week, and next week we go to the towns that weren't poisoned. They were simply erased. No warning, no buyout, no record, just gone.